Welcome to the Conduct Detrimental Podcast. This is your co-host, Dan Worley. We're having a great year-end episode here, a really fun topic. We're going to go ahead and try to count down the top 10 sports law stories from 2016. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, sports lawyer, Daniel Wallach. Dan, how are you?
I'm doing fine, Dan. Happy New Year. And, it's apropos that we're doing our top 10 list of 2016 in 2017, just so that we can have the last word on the subject. And it was very difficult narrowing down the top 10. We probably could easily have come up with 20 to 30, but I think this is a fairly representative list, and I'm looking forward to going through it with you and our special guest. And Dan, why don't you introduce our guest?
Yeah, we have just a great guest on, and when we started talking about this topic, I was like, we need to get Ian, because Ian is the guy that tracks from week to week all the top sports law stories going on. Ian Gunn is his name. He's a New Orleans attorney. He's also a writer for our friends, the website sportsesquires.com. And what I was referring to is what are called the sports law links. And Ian, they come out every Monday. Is that right?
Yeah, they're every Monday.
And it's literally every Monday. I mean, I think Ian may have missed like a week the entire year, and it was because he was probably out of the country on vacation or something. But the man is very consistent.
No excuse for that.
I took a week off for first year anniversary trip, and I think they're coming out tomorrow because of New Year's instead of on Monday. So,
well, perfect. This podcast is coming out tomorrow. We're recording on Monday night, and it's coming out Tuesday morning. So when you're listening, they'll already be out.
Will this podcast make the cut?
Ian? Well, that depends on when you get the link posted, right?
Okay.
That's a challenge. I might be up late now. Well, Ian, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Do you have any words about the year in sports law 2016?
Well, thanks for having me, guys. I think that this year maybe was different from previous years. I've been covering sports law just in the sheer number of big cases. I mean, every year there's always something going on in sports law, little things here or there, but I think there were just so many cases that blew up and were huge in the various sports and in the nature of the media coverage. And I think that there were so many cases that reached higher levels, whether it's the appellate level, the Supreme Court level, huge investigations, the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So I think this year was a little unique in terms of just the sheer media attention to certain big cases. There seemed to be more big cases this year than in previous years, at least from my experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Dan and I have actually touched on this. We talked about it, I think. And I really thought about whether that's just happenstance or whether it's more of a fact of the media covering it more closely, and there's more sports law in the news and people will care more now, or maybe I'm just paying more attention so we think they're more important than they are.
There's definitely been a rise in interest in sports law, and I think that's not just because of some of these big cases. I mean, certainly we saw, especially in the Northeast, a huge interest in sports law because of Deflategate. But just generally around sports, I mean, 20 years ago, no one was paying attention to, how much cap space does my team have? What are the sort of cap maneuvers or sort of legal maneuvers that my team can do to get this guy off a suspension? There's so much more knowledge and interest among fans about how the law and how business affects their sports teams and the sports they're interested in. I think a big part of that is the internet and the access to information. But everybody is so much more interested in these sports law issues, and so that drives the media coverage. If eyeballs are going to be looking at this story, the media wants to have it covered, and they want to be able to cover what's going on in court because people will read it.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's the rise of Twitter and competition among news outlets and even among sports law commentators. You have this monumental growth in the number of lawyers that speak cogently on sports law issues. I mean, 10 years ago, maybe it was like Mike McCann, Gabe Feldman, and a few others. And now it's endless. There are online publications, Vocative, USA Today is constantly doing investigative pieces. So nothing escapes the attention of the news media and the Twitter sphere. We are on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So the stories that got scant attention or would have gotten scant attention 5 years ago, 10 years ago, are now on this endless loop of commentary and interest.
Yeah, I think a great example of this access to information that we would never have had before Twitter, before more people like us out there, was one of the cases that may or may not have made the top 10. We'll have to wait and see, but Deflategate. And I know both of you two had just unbelievable coverage of Deflategate, and not only commentary about what was happening, but actually, tweeting out parts of pleadings and explaining what they mean, explaining how they fit into context, and people were just eating that up. You guys were getting hundreds and hundreds of retweets, and fans were asking hundreds of questions, and I know that sometimes that led into late Friday nights into early Saturday mornings, and it was just kind of a wild experience. And so, things like that really grew, I think, all three of our followings, but also grew an interest among the average sports fan that wasn't necessarily a lawyer, but now had access to this information about how things were argued in courts and by the lawyers.
And I mean, I guess I'll take this one. That's how Ian Gunn and I met. I didn't know Ian before Deflategate. He and I, started tweeting, live tweeting the court filings in Deflategate for 5 or 6 successive Friday nights in a row. It just seemed on every Friday night there was a key document that was released on Pacer. And he and I just...
Dan and I are by what we do on our Friday nights.
Yeah, on my birthday, no less. On Friday,
you guys
August
are outing
7th.
Yourselves. It's bad.
On August 7th, Friday night, my birthday, I spent my birthday behind a computer screen tweeting segments of the NFL's and the NFLPA's, motion papers and our followings. And I didn't do this, for Twitter hits, but within the span of 24 hours, my Twitter following, quadrupled. And I'm sure Ian, experienced a similar, uptick in in his followers and people who are, interested in his, in his commentary. And that kind of catapulted us, and Dan as well. And I think it began probably the most exciting, from a sports law perspective, the most exciting, 4 or 5 week period in the entire Deflategate saga.
Yeah, definitely. I think with that, we'll get right into it. We'll get into our, as I mentioned, we ranked the top 10 stories. And here's what we did. I emailed these guys. I said, listen, give me your top 10. I'll make my top 10. And then we weighted them. So all three of us made our top 10. If one of us rated one case or one story first, it would get 10 points, second 9 points, etc. And then I added that all together and made a master top 10. And we're going to go through that in a second. But I wanted to start with just listing off, as Dan mentioned, there was probably 20 or 30 that went into consideration. And we have a little list here of sort of honorable mention that didn't make the final cut but deserve a mention. And those include WikiLeaks, the Joe Mixon tape, the Aaron Andrews trial, the NFL team relocations, still going on, the U.S. women's national team labor struggle, also still going on, Dennis Weidman lawsuit against the NHL, still going, FIFA corruption, still going, and then also, like we just talked about, kind of a general note of the broader coverage of sports law in the media sphere. You guys have any comments on the honorable mentions?
Well, they, for good reason, are not in our top 10, but several of those stories are likely to metastasize, so to speak, in 2017. Joe Mixon will be a story worth watching if he declares for the NFL draft.
I think he's coming back next year.
We had a podcast episode on this. I think he's coming out.
Well, he announced he's going back to school.
Yeah, he did. He did announce that, but I think as a running back, Well, it's not final, but as a running back, he takes a significant risk with his health and with his future career earnings if he goes back to college and gets a severe injury or misses time. I think it's too perilous a position to simply roll the dice and think that he can rehabilitate his image a year down the road and maybe become a first-round draft pick after another year in college. I think the die is cast, the damage is done, and he might as well just come out and play football. Clearly, he's an NFL caliber running back. So if he comes out, the story will definitely transition from honorable mention to possibly a top 10 story next year. And you may be right about his ultimate fate. Maybe he does go back.
Right. And I think the similar, along the lines with that is, the NFL team relocations is certainly something that, obviously still ongoing with the Raiders potentially moving. But we've already started to see lawsuits filed by Rams fans against the Rams for leaving St. Louis. I think there was a lawsuit recently about season ticket holders in St. Louis being upset. And so certainly, when with the Chargers, moving, with the Raiders potentially moving, and certainly there's going to be more fallout from the Rams. More lawsuits are going to be filed in 2017 related to that. Certainly, I think the FIFA corruption story, which wasn't something that kind of broke in 2016, which I think is why it kind of was more of an honorable mention. But that's something that we're going to continue to see the fallout for years to come, obviously. I mean, that organization is going to be affected for years from all of the corruption scandals and legal issues that are going on with that.
Yeah, and I think the one for me that stands out in that list is the Dennis Weidman lawsuit. It really was, I think the only reason it didn't get more attention than it did is because it was NHL. It's not a huge name player. It's not Tom Brady, in other words, but it really was the reverse Deflategate. And it also involved a concussion, and so it kind of had all these sports law issues wrapped into one case, and it's really a wild scenario that all came together at once. And the summary judgment, which is going to decide the whole case, the parties have agreed to, has been filed, argued, it's ready to go. I mean, I think any day now that story could come out. So that's definitely one in early 2017 to keep an eye on.
Right. I think, too, for people who want to learn more about sports law and are interested in that sort of thing, that's kind of neat case to read about just because it's not this broad, wide-reaching case like FIFA or, like NFL team relocations or everything under the sun. It's on a specific issue, and you really can kind of see how the different legal issues affect sports, what the process is in this one little case in the NHL. And it's a good primer for a lot of sports law issues.
Yeah, I think what kept the Weidman case off our top 10 list was the absence of any decision. It was briefed and the lawsuit was filed in mid-June, and the parties dispensed with oral argument. There were no, live, court arguments made by lawyers from both sides. Unlike Deflategate, which was argued before Judge Berman over a several-day period. Then there was an appellate oral argument in Deflategate. Weidman had none of that. The parties stipulated to submit it on the papers and have the judge in the case decide it solely on the basis of the paperwork. And so there was no live court hearing, and we're still waiting for a decision. So perhaps in 2017, Weidman could be a much bigger story, particularly if the lower court agrees with the National Hockey League, and we end up with with sort of inherently irreconcilable cases within the same courthouse. You have Deflategate's suspension being upheld by the Second Circuit, and then potentially the NHL's argument in vacating an arbitration award could succeed. So it sets up a very interesting dynamic depending on the outcome of the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only could we see that district court opinion, but as you guys noted, we could see the appeal and then maybe even, a Supreme Court petition. Obviously unlikely, but who knows? All right, so moving on. There was three stories. I don't know if we show them cases or stories. Probably stories that got votes from us, but didn't make the top 10. The first one is the NCAA amateurism cases, and that sort of entails the O'Bannon decision, the Jenkins case that's out there, the Alston case that's out there, and a few others. And I think similar to what we were talking about with Weidman, these cases, didn't really have may have been top 10 cases in other years, but this just wasn't the year for that. It could definitely be a huge story next year or the following year as well, depending on how this Jenkins case goes. But that was one of them. The next one was the minor league class action lawsuit, and I think, Ian, you're one of the ones that voted for this. What did you think about that one?
Yeah, that was it's an interesting case that's going on. The court actually granted MLB's motion to decertify the class. I mean, basically what the case is that minor league baseball players are suing in relation to the Fair Labor Standards Act, basically saying that they're being paid below minimum wage. And the court actually granted the decertification motion from the MLB, saying basically that the cases were too different. Each player's situation was too distinct from other players to count as a class. But the interesting thing to look forward going into 2017 is that actually the court has allowed the plaintiffs to repropose a new class that's a little bit more defined to try to allow the plaintiffs to meet the class action standards that they have to meet. So certainly that's a big issue that could affect all of minor league baseball, which is huge. It affects so many athletes and so many fans as well. So that's definitely one to keep an eye on for 2017 that had an interesting decision this year.
Yeah, Ian, how are the classes going to be redefined? I mean, the motion to certify limited classes remains pending. Is this a class that's only limited to current minor league players? Is that how the modification of the classes is going to work? Should she grant, or should the judge grant certification?
Well, I don't think the difficulty isn't between current or former. The difficulty is between how some of these players' cases are. I mean, there's different types of minor league baseball, and there's different player situations. So some players might have played for 2-3 months. Some might have played for a whole season. Some may have been called up and then sent back down. There's all kinds of different issues in terms of the amount of time that they're playing. And so I think the court, when looking at how much they're being paid and what their situations are and what their benefits are, is trying to say these are very disparate cases, and the uniformity is not really there.
Yeah, well, I hope to see a positive outcome for the minor league players, because this notion that Major League Baseball has this exemption from having to pay overtime based on this seasonal or amusement, exemption, I think is a crock. And the players have historically been underpaid. They earn less than minimum wage workers when you average in or factor in the number of hours that they devote to playing baseball, mandatory on almost a year-round basis. So this case has the potential for upending the entire system of compensation for minor league baseball players.
Yeah, so the next one was the final one before we reached the top 10. It actually got 7 votes or 7 points, so it missed the cut by 1 vote, and that was the NFL concussion settlement. And again, I think this was a little bit anticlimactic this year. We just had an entire podcast on this topic, so if you're interested in it, I would recommend checking it out with Paul Anderson. He was fantastic. He had a great background of the case. Again, another one where that struggle is finally over with. The settlement is finalized. There will be no Supreme Court intervention. But now there are these 50 opt-out cases where there'll be individual players going after the NFL. And you'd have to think that a few of those, hopefully, at least a few of them, will ultimately go to trial and not be settled, although maybe they'll settle all of them. But, I think when we finally get a player against the NFL in a jury trial, it could be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is the one item on the honorable mention list that I really disagreed with its placement. I think it should be on the top 10 list because it's not only the NFL, it's NHL, WWE, the NCAA cases. I think we've just hit the tip of the iceberg with concussion litigation, and the settlement, which was approved by the Third Circuit in 2016, and then the Supreme Court denied certiorari. I think is going to open up a window to even more sports concussion litigation, and we're starting to see it. The 50 suits filed against the NCAA, the WWE has a number of cases, and the NHL has come into focus as well. So I think this is going to be a major sports law story moving forward for at least the next several years, particularly as more knowledge and science develops around the diagnosis of CTE.
Look at that. We made it 20 minutes, and we finally got to the top 10. Sorry, audience. We will leave you hanging no longer. So, number 10, finally there. HGH Gate, which is one of the stories that I actually sort of forgot about because it was a big story for a couple months there and then fell off the map. But if you don't remember, Al Jazeera, the news outlet, came out with a documentary called The Dark Side, which accused... Peyton Manning was the headliner, obviously, but also Clay Matthews, Julius Peppers, James Harrison, Mike Neal, Ryan Howard, Ryan Zimmerman, of using PEDs, and it became a huge story, and there was threats of defamation lawsuits. There was a big tension between many of the NFL players, not named Peyton Manning, and the NFL to meet with Roger Goodell and talk to him about these allegations. Ultimately, it didn't end up in too much, right? So ultimately, Peyton Manning was cleared. He allegedly cooperated with Goodell. The rest of the players finally met with Goodell, were cleared. There was no NFL suspensions, no MLB suspensions. Most of the defamation lawsuits ended up not happening, most notably Peyton Manning, who originally threatened to do so. But we do have two lawsuits which have emerged into one, and those are Ryan Zimmerman and Ryan Howard both filed federal lawsuits, defamation lawsuits in D.C. Circuit Court, D.C. District Court, against Al Jazeera and against Liam Collins, who was the reporter, or the mole, if you will, in the case. And Al Jazeera has moved to dismiss those cases, and we're just waiting on a decision there. So we'll see if those lawsuits end up moving forward. But what made you guys include HGH Gate in the top 10?
I think from my standpoint, this was kind of like the first big new sports law story of the year. I mean, this broke, back in January, I think, or late December. And I think just the nature of this story kind of hit a bunch of different points. One, Peyton Manning obviously was the big headliner, and this broke, right as the Broncos are making their playoff run. The rumors that this is Peyton Manning's last year, and he may retire. He's trying to get that second Super Bowl to cap off his career, and I think right as that's all happening, this Al Jazeera story breaks that he's been doping with HGH. And then you toss in all the other big-name players like Ryan Zimmerman, Ryan Howard, Clay Matthews, and the media attention all of a sudden on this doping issue that we haven't seen. We've seen it in baseball, certainly, but we haven't seen HGH issues really hit the media big in the NFL the way this story did. So I think that was kind of my rationale for putting it in there. If it had amounted to a little bit more, we probably would have been talking about this higher on the list. But I think just the fact that it implicated these players in this sort of serious allegation, and certainly it's been continuing with the defamation lawsuits that are ongoing. I think the irony is, too, looking back, Al Jazeera America folded and closed up shop pretty soon after the report happened. Of course, Al Jazeera, the entire news entity, is still going, but the organization that promoted the documentary and was engaged in creating it is now gone, basically. But I think just the sheer high-profile nature of the allegations and the athletes and the timing of it with Peyton Manning's Super Bowl run is why I put it up there.
Yeah, I think the story should have been much higher on the list, and the reason it wasn't is that the NFL had no appetite to pursue it. I mean, remember what happened with Major League Baseball? They filed a tortious interference lawsuit against a Florida HGH mill in order to get access to the records. Here, the NFL lacks subpoena power over the Geyer Institute, which is the HGH lab in Indianapolis. They lacked subpoena power over Al Jazeera, and I think the NFL wanted to let this issue die because it had the potential to be very, wide-ranging and broad in its sweep. And when you're dealing with Peyton Manning, who is, basically a national hero, I think the NFL didn't want to go there. Clearly, where there's smoke, there's fire. And I recall that, Manning's team never disputed that these HGH shipments were sent to his house or that he was treated by an HGH lab. And had this been Tom Brady, I'm not so certain that the NFL would have as easily and as readily looked the other way. So I think this was the great whitewash of 2016 rather than the great sports law story of 2016.
It's interesting. I on one hand, I want to think that the NFL learned from Deflategate, but on the other hand, if you look at the way that the NFL went after the other players, while saying that Peyton cooperated and he's been clear, but now we're going to go after, Peppers and Matthews and James Harrison. I remember the James Harrison fiasco here. James Harrison said he would he would meet him if Roger Goodell came to his practice or came to his house. I think it was. Yeah. Actually pretty hilarious.
And Peyton Manning was going to file a defamation lawsuit. And, I mean, come on. He hires a crisis management team, Ari Fleischer. They go into spin mode almost overnight, and then the story disappears. I mean, come on. I think it does make a lot of New England Patriots fans very angry, among other issues such as walkie-talkie gate and, other issues where the league treats other players with less of an iron fist than they've treated the New England Patriots. So it does, kind of poke at some selective enforcement issues within the NFL.
It certainly was a very interesting contrast with Deflategate, that just the decision came down just a couple months later after this all broke, between how the league treated Manning and for a serious doping allegation, which Roger Goodell compared Brady deflating balls to doping and PED usage, and how those two cases were treated and handled by the league.
Yeah, and it's one thing that also caught my eye was just that this was really the first exercise of Goodell's power after the appellate decision in Deflategate came out, which basically gave him this huge, wide-sweeping power over players. And there was this awkward tension of him getting interviews with these other guys, and it was really the first time that he flexed his muscle, and the PA ultimately backed down. The NFL ultimately didn't go anywhere with the case, obviously. They didn't do anything, but he was able to muscle his way into getting interviews over something that had very little concrete evidence. As Dan noted, there was no subpoena power, so they couldn't get any evidence. And the main guy that they was saying that these guys had doped, Charlie Sly, had completely recanted his story already over YouTube right after the documentary came out. Whether or not that was, a truthful recantment or not, who knows? But ultimately, they had very little to go on, but yet they still forced the interview. So,
one of the great sports law names of the year, Charlie Sly.
That should be our next top 10 list, sports law names. All right, moving on, number 9. By the way, HGHgate got 8 total votes. Number 9, which is the Russian doping scandal, got 9 votes. But only one of the three of us actually voted for it. So we'll let Ian do the explaining since he's the one that voted for it.
I'll take this one. I really, similar to how Dan thought, HGH should have been higher, I really think that the Russian doping scandal should have been up there. I had it number 3 on my list, and the lack of support from the two Dans drops it so far down. But I thought this was a huge issue. If you remember, among other things, Professor Richard McLaren's WADA report found evidence that more than 1,000 Russian athletes had been involved in doping misconduct of some kind, whether it was actual doping or tampering with a test or trying to evade testing, or cooperating with people who were providing, doping supplements to athletes. And to me, just such a huge issue going with the Olympics this year. The Russian athletes wound up being completely banned from the Paralympics. They were banned from several events in the regular Olympics. The IOC kind of copped out and left each sport's governing body the decision to whether to ban Russian athletes completely from that individual sport during the Olympics, instead of taking the decision to say, no, this was an actual institutional attempt to cheat. by the entire Russian athletic system. And I really think they probably should have banned Russia from competing in the Olympic based upon how extensive their actions were to try to cheat in sports. And I think that the IOC is still taking action against athletes for test tampering and some other things. And I just saw recently, maybe a week or two ago, a Russian sports official admitted that this was an institutional conspiracy to dope. And it included not just this Olympics and this Paralympics, but previous Olympics, like the 2012 Olympics in London, were implicated. And so this is a situation where you have a country that's very big in international sports in terms of winning medals in the Olympics and the Paralympics, actually engaging in this institution-wide attempt to cheat with drugs. And so it's who knows which sports are now tainted by having medals won by Russian athletes who doped and we don't know, or doped and we do know, and they were allowed to compete. And I think that this was huge with the Olympics going on this year and the Paralympics, and the fact that this was an entire country, and not just any country, but a country that competes successfully at the Olympics and wins a lot of medals. So I thought this was a huge story, especially in international sports law.
Yeah, I feel slightly guilty for not putting it in my top 10. Obviously, this is a very subjective list, and the reason I didn't do so, I think, was just because I enjoyed the Olympics this year. I just didn't quite dig into some of these issues outside of having to teach the CAS arbitration system in my sports law class this summer. But for whatever reason, I just didn't follow it as closely. But it obviously was a really important case, affected the Olympics, which is arguably the biggest sporting event out there. But when we came down to making the top 10, I just couldn't squeeze it in. Dan, thoughts?
No, and for a change, I'll sit this one out because it wasn't one of the subjects that I voted for. I think on a broader international scale, it is certainly one of the top 10, if not one of the top 1, 2, or 3 sports law stories of the year. But within the United States realm, which we basically cover, it didn't move the needle enough for me. I think my focus has been more on the U.S. professional and amateur leagues, and it's more of an international story than it is a domestic story.
Right, and I think part of the reason, too, why it didn't get as much coverage as it probably should have is when, in the lead up to the Olympics, is kind of when all the news broke. And so at that point, sports media has to make this decision, well, are we going to cover the Russian doping or are we going to cover the Olympics? And it's like you're obligated by your job to cover the Olympics. There's so much news going on, especially in America with all the different athletes that we have who are competing and the high profile sports situations. And certainly I think that I remember the team at USA Today did a lot of great work on the Russian doping domestically, but it's the sort of thing where it was one of those stories where you would think that it would have gotten more attention because it broke right before the Olympics, but in reality what wound up happening is the media coverage shifted immediately to covering the actual sports. And then, after the Olympics pass, we get into football season and the NFL's king in America, so kind of the appetite for that goes away. But it was one of those stories that probably should have been bigger domestically, but certainly is huge internationally.
Yeah.
I think for me, the Olympic story that really got my attention was the disciplinary actions taken against Hope Solo and the swimmer Ryan Lochte. I mean, we have two of those athletes who are now suspended from competition as a result of in one case a fabricated robbery, and the other Hope Solo made disparaging comments about the style of play that Team Sweden engaged in. So for me, the Olympic story that really got my attention were the individual disciplinary actions, not so much the Russian doping, although that is a much bigger scandal in the scheme of things, and I'm surprised Hope Solo didn't make it higher up the list.
Right. And I think the Ryan Lochte story was interesting just from the standpoint of there were so many twists and turns, and at the end of it, you really just didn't know what to believe. It reminded me very much of, in a different way, but it reminded me very much of the Manti Te'o situation where there were so many lies or fabrications or twists and turns. What is going on now? Wait, what's the new news that's coming out? And that is the sort of case that was. It was just inexplicable.
Yeah, I'll have to admit, when I was considering these, I didn't even think about the Lochte Gate. That was an epic, if short-lived, story this year as well. So we'll have to at least add that to our honorable mention list. The next one, number 8 on our list, is the rise in athlete activism. And in two real cases that we kind of grouped together here stuck out. Obviously, the Colin Kaepernick story of him kneeling during the national anthem, which then spread to a number of other athletes at all levels. And then also the University of Minnesota boycott, or, threat to boycott, I guess we should call it. In this story got 10 votes, and obviously they're very different types of activism. And activism in sports is nothing new, but these two stories really caught the media's attention like I can't remember, at least for a number of years. What do you guys think?
Well, I view the Colin Kaepernick situation and the rise in athlete activism as directly correlative to the tinder block of race relations in this country. You have, a number of police shootings involving white officers, black men, and the failure of our justice system to give equal justice under the law to individuals who are of color. And when you combine that with the limited rights that athletes have under their agreements, they have limited mobility, their compensation is restricted, they're told what to say, what to do, what to wear. I think it was inevitable that athletes would begin speaking out about the nature of race relations in this country. Michael Jordan had always refrained from taking a stand and getting on a soapbox because he didn't want to hurt his endorsement income. But we're in a different age now, and the shocking number of incidents involving shootings of black men and the failures of our justice system have really, compelled black athletes to speak out. And Colin Kaepernick deserves a ton of credit for being the one to break that barrier, because he basically opened the door for other athletes to, I think, come out and join him. And we're about to enter a dynamic phase here with the Donald Trump presidency. I think the issue of race relations are going to remain at the fore in our national discussion. And I think athletes speaking out and becoming active in the national discourse is going to grow significantly over the next 4 years.
Yeah, and I think that athletes are really... not to say that athletes before didn't realize the voice that they had or the power that they had. Certainly, there's a long history of athletes speaking out for all kinds of controversial issues, whether it's the raised fist at the Olympics or whatnot. But certainly, I think now even players who are on the bench, like Kaepernick was at the time, are realizing that they have a voice and that they're speaking out, and they can get attention and they can really impact things and really change things in a significant way. I think we're starting to see that all over the NCAA, not just with the Minnesota case, but going back to last year with the Northwestern case and college players attempting to unionize. Players are standing up all over, whether it's the NCAA or pro sports, and saying, whatever these social issues are that we think need attention, we can actually do something about it, and our voices have some sort of impact, especially with the fans, especially in the media, that can actually get something done.
Yeah, I think the Missouri football team was another notable example from last year as well. I just kind of comparing these two, the Kaepernick one's very, very difficult for me. I've actually never even commented on it because it's kind of near and dear because my wife's active duty military, so I'm in a military family. So that angle is tough, but also, having been a lawyer, I am a lawyer, and having been through law school and con law classes, the freedom of speech is exceptionally important. So it's tough, but I think the Minnesota case, the other one, hopefully is a lesson for those wanting to do these type of demonstrations that you really should be a little more prepared and know what you're demonstrating for exactly. I think that was a very misguided demonstration on their behalf, especially after reading the 50-page university report, it's really difficult to imagine anyone standing up for those players if even 1% of those allegations are true, which I'm not saying that they are, but even the appearance of that is not a good look. So, hopefully, I think the Kaepernick's demonstration was very well thought out and planned on his behalf, and he did it for a few games and no one even noticed. And then they finally noticed and the whole story blew up, but the Minnesota one, on the other hand, was not.
Yeah, it's kind of a tale of two very different types of activism. One was, very premeditated and thought out and kind of planned as this is how I'm going to do it, and this is the message that I want to send. And the other one with Minnesota was kind of a knee-jerk reaction without kind of really looking into, what's the situation, what's going on. And certainly, not too political, but to try to relate to what you were saying earlier, Dan, with the flag situation. It reminds me of the story that Antonin Scalia told when he actually ruled in favor of allowing flag burning as protected under the First Amendment. He said, for me as a conservative, I think that flag burners should be locked up, but I think it's protected under the First Amendment. So I wrote this opinion protecting it, and I had to walk down to breakfast the next morning, and my wife was whistling "It's a Grand Old Flag," so I still had to come home to my conservative wife upset, but that's what the First Amendment said. So I think, one of the things with these sorts of cases is, one was misguided, one, we can argue about, but it's also a great example of what makes American sports great is that, athletes can speak their mind, they can have an impact, and that's all protected under the First Amendment.
Yeah, I have no such conflicts in my household. I don't have a wife from a military family or a wife who comes from a more conservative ideology. So I'll throw a few car bombs in the mix here because I think the situation is going to get worse before it gets better. Black men, they're dying on the street. There's a lack of accountability in the justice system, and I think this situation will become louder. And, it's not going to begin and end. It's going to begin with Colin Kaepernick, but I don't see this going away anytime soon. I think athletes are going to increasingly make their voices heard, and it's going to make white America increasingly more uncomfortable.
Yeah, I agree that it's definitely another one to keep an eye on moving forward, and we still see athletes kneeling at various sporting events. So it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues moving on. But for us, moving along to number 7, awkward transition.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just had to put my 2 cents in about the state of race relations in this because it absolutely is. It's at a nadir,
Yeah, no, I gotcha. Number 7 with 12 votes, an equally as important topic: daily fantasy sports. Probably would have been much higher on the list a year before, maybe. But certainly warranted number 7. Dan, you want to give the brief rundown of everything that happened in 2016?
Well, I mean, it all stems from the the annoying advertising which took over the airwaves in the beginning of the 2015 NFL season, followed several weeks later by a data leak which presumably gave insiders and employees at DraftKings and FanDuel an unfair advantage in playing contests on the other company' sites. Long story short, it increased the heat on the fantasy sports industry and led many lawmakers to question and law enforcement officials to question whether the activity was in fact a form of gambling which was illegal, and that spurred a rise in legislative activity and lobbying. And throughout 2016, the daily fantasy sports industry successfully persuaded 8 states to expressly legalize fantasy sports, but that leaves a fracture throughout the country where 8 states have legalized it. 10 or 20 are in a sort of a state of flux, and then the companies are offering their contests, I think, in as many as 40 states. So over the course of the next year, or the course of the next 3 to 5 years, I think we'll start seeing an increase in legislative activity with more and more states expressly legalizing fantasy sports. But it raises the question, if DFS is legal and is being made legal by states, and it's a form of sports gambling, then how do you treat traditional sports gambling? So the DFS debate occurs against the backdrop of the broader question of whether and how to legalize sports betting. So I think if of any industry, the DFS industry is like the cat with 9 lives, which should have killed it a year ago, which was the whiff of or the allegations of gambling, coupled with what could have been a widespread cheating scandal, which should have doomed any industry. Basically, had very little had an initial impact on DraftKings and FanDuel, but over the course of the last year, I think these companies have successfully weathered the storm and are now pointed towards the future and trying to lobby additional states. And of course, DraftKings and FanDuel have entered into a merger agreement, and we're waiting over the course of the next few months to see what the Federal Trade Commission has to say about that. Because it does raise concerns about a potential monopoly and anti-competitive effects. So I think the biggest story in fantasy sports moving forward will be whether the two behemoths of the DFS industry will be allowed to merge. But the story of 2016 is the industry rose from the ashes of near death to potentially righting the ship, and are now, moving closer towards full legalization on a state-by-state basis.
Right, and I think the irony of what's been going on this year is that the DFS industry is trying to kind of put the cat back in the bag. They're doing this year what they should have been doing a year ago, or even further before that, is try to set themselves on a solid legal footing so that they can get back to the business of building their industry. And I think that, if this would be a totally different story if they had started out with state-by-state lobbying, if they started out by getting bills passed, preaching, even though there's not a whole lot of revenue, legislators love to talk up the fact that, this could bring our state more revenue, we're in a budget crisis, sell that, get the bill passed to legalize DFS in the state. And then once you've got, especially in the big play states in New York, in Florida, in California, and in other states, once you've got some states saying, hey, this is legal for sure, we passed the law, then you go out and do, this year, you do your big advertising push. Instead, what we saw last year was this all-out advertising push. It seemed like every single game you were watching, whether it was college or NFL, every commercial almost was a DFS commercial. It almost was similar to election, campaign coverage, where you would see all these election ads leading up to the election. And this year, you haven't really seen the ads, and they're really focusing on how can we get legalized, how can we resolve these legal disputes. And it's a sort of verse of what they should have done.
Well, Ian, it's not really a matter of choice. They have no choice. DraftKings and FanDuel aren't flush with the kind of venture capital, funding that they had a year ago. The decision to tamp down the advertising, to some extent, it's a conscious decision to reduce the advertising. But as in the real world, they're struggling financially, and economic circumstances forced them to enter into a merger agreement. So even if they had wanted.
I'm just saying that what they should have done before they did the big ad push was allot the money towards, the legalization strategy and then gone with the ad push. I totally understand why they're not doing ads now. They don't have the money. They're fighting all these legal battles, and they're trying to consolidate as well. So, it makes sense what they're doing now. I'm just saying a little bit more foresight could have allowed them to have the ad blast going on with a much better legal footing.
Yeah, but I agree with you. But they sold the notion to their investors that that they were 100% legal. To have acknowledged the legal uncertainty, I think would have turned off investors. And without the backing of the NBA, the NFL, the NHL, and some of the major media companies, I think DraftKings could very well have been dead and buried based on what happened last year. And they were able to get basically a second life because of who was behind them. Had this happened several years ago, they may not be around to talk about it today.
Yeah, all good points. I think, the big takeaway is that the dynamic from 2015 to 2016 really changed, and a lot that had to do with the legal battles they were fighting. And I think that ultimately forced their hand into the merger. They may be a struggling industry, and it'll be interesting to see if sports gambling, traditional sports gambling, is legalized in the relatively near future. What happens to that industry as well? So, because in my opinion, I think that a lot of their patronage would go away if they could just traditionally gamble on sports. But I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. If you would have asked me this time last year what I thought the number one story for this year would be, it certainly would be this one, and that is the two new collective bargaining agreements in the NBA and Major League Baseball. I think that from just a coverage standpoint and following it, these were a little bit disappointing because they were so smooth. They both got done relatively, without a hitch. I think they're both going to be very fascinating agreements. We haven't seen everything that's in them. They're still drafting the finalized agreements, but all the details have been agreed to. They've been ratified. We're all set. We have labor peace for another 5 or 6 years. What do you guys think about the labor disputes kind of going through with a whimper in 2016?
Well, I think I definitely thought these should have been higher. I mean, I had them at the top of my list for top 10 just because of the sheer length of time that these two issues are going to be affecting sports. The NBA, I think, goes through 2024, and the MLB's goes through 2021. I definitely think that the NBA deal is a much bigger deal than the MLB deal. The MLB, and MLB Players Association definitely had a history of labor peace, of getting along. It's been years and years and years since they've had a lockout or a strike.
Yeah, I think they also didn't make that many changes from what's been reported. I think a lot of it was status quo. They're just moving forward.
Right. But I think the big deal with the NBA was not only was there a labor dispute last time the CBA came up for renegotiation and there was a lockout, but I think that this time you saw the new NBA Players Association head, Michelle Roberts, came in and was, basically blazing fire, saying, she was going to take down the league on all these different issues and she was going to renegotiate things. And initially you thought, okay, well, we're definitely going to have a showdown between the players in the league. And it turns out that, as her tenure developed, she, I guess, wound up developing a better relationship with Adam Silver. And they wound up having a great working relationship to get this sort of thing done. It turned out it was kind of a Woj bomb that just dropped and said, NBA and NBA Players Association close to finalizing a deal. It came out of nowhere. I certainly, like you were saying, didn't expect this to be so smooth. But I also think it was a big deal because you look at all the big changes that the NBA has been going through with the fact that the cap jumped significantly this year and the previous year, and there was no cap smoothing that happened. I think there was a lot of concern that there was going to be some overreaction to the big cap jump, that the league was going to push for certain things to try to prevent this, or that the players were going to look to capitalize on this, that max salary is going to be significantly affected or potentially gotten rid of completely. And I think that what you've seen is they've made some minor changes each way, but for the most part, I think the older players like Chris Paul and LeBron James are going to be able to get the 5-year max contract based on 36 and over rule being changed. But for the most part, they said, look, the league is in a great situation right now, and we don't want to jeopardize that, and we want to capitalize on our momentum.
Yeah, I think for me, the the answer to the NBA collective bargaining issue was the fact that the pie keeps growing. Whether it's 50%, 49%, 51%, the overall pie keeps raising every year with the influx of new TV revenue. So I think this was a relatively easy deal to strike. Unlike the NFL, where you have 50 players on each team, over 32 teams, and an NBA roster is only 12 to 15 players. Everybody makes money in the NBA. The top players make in excess of 8 figures. They're in contracts. There is a shortened lifespan for players to earn their livelihood. So all the factors that would normally give rise to a strike situation in, let's say, the National Football League simply don't exist in the NBA. Times are good. The money keeps rising, and the value of the top contracts keeps rising. Now, what had to happen this time around, which was important, was for once the mid-level exception and other exceptions are tied to the increase of revenue and are not like flat numbers as they had been in past years. But just overall, I don't think the economics were there for the players to take this to court or to battle in a lockout situation. There was every reason in the world to settle. And with Billy Hunter out of the equation and a new dynamic between Michelle Roberts and Adam Kessler, who the players trust, I just didn't think this had the possibility of getting into a lockout like it had several years ago. So this was an easy one.
I kind of disagree. Not that the end result and all those reasons, but I just personally thought that it was going to end up in a huge battle, and that's because the 2011 negotiations, the players took a big haircut. The owners were claiming that they were losing all this money, that only the huge teams were profitable, the rest of the teams were losing money. We can't do this. So they took a much less percentage of the BRI. I think they dropped like 6 percentage points. And
I think it was more. It was a 58 to between 49 and 51. So could be as much as 9%.
Right. And so fast forward to now, the league is extremely profitable. They signed this huge TV deal. The Clippers sell for $2 billion, and the players are like, well, now we need to get our money back. We need to get our percentage back. And the fact that they had Michelle Roberts come in, they as Ian mentioned, she came out firing, basically saying that she would be shocked if there was no lock, no stoppage, and that was obviously posturing to a certain extent, but. Her history as a labor attorney would demonstrate that she was going to fight tooth and nail, and for them to roll over on the BRI issue, I know that although they didn't change the BRI number, they changed how it was calculated, so the players will get a little bit more money, but in the end, for them not to get any of that BRI percentage back was pretty shocking to me that they would accept a deal without that. But I think, to both your guys' points, the fact that the league's doing so well and they're getting bigger contracts now because of this huge TV deal, they're like, it's fine. It's not worth it for us to miss games.
Yeah, what I'd like to see in the future, I'm sorry, Ian, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'll make the point real quickly. As franchises are selling for astronomical amounts, record amounts, like $2 billion in the case of the Los Angeles Clippers, what I'd like to see the players fight for is to include increased franchise valuations, particularly when the teams are sold, to somehow capture that in BRI. Then I think the money that's really available will reflect economic reality. To carve that out and not include that in BRI basically allows the owners to point to operating income and losses without reflecting where the real money comes in when they flip the teams.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great point, and I agree that that's something the players are really losing out on. But at the same time, that's not really like a liquid asset or any sort of solid valuation that it would be really hard for the players to be able to have some sort of concrete equation for them to figure out how this would affect them, since valuations change so easily. Basically because you had somebody who was willing to buy the Clippers for $2 billion, the valuation of all the teams in the NBA just jumped overnight. But I think the interesting thing to me too about the NBA, CBA, and also the MLB is it's a case in contrast with the NFL. Everyone wants to keep talking about how Roger Goodell has done such a terrible job, or how the owners are behind him 100% because he's making all this money. I think Adam Silver has shown look, you can still make a ton of money as a league and yet find a way to be a responsible commissioner, find a way to work with the players, have a great relationship with the players. And not to put this all on him, obviously, Michelle Roberts has done a great deal and has worked really hard to make that relationship improve. And both sides on the MLB have done that as well. But, I mean, it's definitely a tale of contrasts of how these leagues continue to build their revenue and continue to do it while working with the players in a way that the NFL appears, nowhere close to being able to do, with, one of the most bitter relationships in all of sports.
Yeah, I mean, I think the third piece of this is the NFL and just how terrible labor relations are there. But, I think that we're so far off from their negotiations, and we still have 4 years, three or 4 years to go, that in reality, I don't know how much it matters because, you look at the lifespan of NFL players and probably 50% of the league is going to be out of the league by the next time this comes around. We may have a new commissioner, unlikely, but it's possible. We may have a new director of PA. So I think there's time for them to patch it up, but they're certainly not on good terms right now. They fight and file lawsuits over everything, which makes life interesting for us, but not the most efficient way to do business. So that's something to keep an eye on. And so I think, enough with the CBAs. Let's move on to which candidly maybe not the fifth most important story of the year. But
first in your heart.
I voted this one not number one, but pretty high on my list.
First
just
in
because
coverage.
Yeah, White Bronco had a lot of Derrick Rose trial, if I haven't tipped it off yet. So I covered this one quite a bit, was real involved, as well as Dan Wallach was as well. And so I think, to me, the reason why I think this was important and was a very interesting case in 2016 was because it was the only actual trial that I can think of where a high-profile celebrity athlete was involved, was in the courtroom in front of a jury on the stand, and then we actually had a jury opinion. And obviously, Derrick Rose was found not liable, and his two friends. And so just the exercise of actually going through the trial, I thought was just really fascinating in this case. It was obviously up until midsummer, really slow case. I was attempting to report on it and write about it, and no one was really paying attention. It finally picked up some steam through some really vulgar court filings that made Derrick Rose look not so great. And finally the media picked up on it. And then through the trial, it was, at least as far as I could tell, it was a huge, huge story.
It became a media circus for the first 6 months or 7, months of the calendar year. No one was really talking about the Rose case. Then you wrote about the summary judgment decision, and slowly but surely it got on the media's radar. And throughout the latter part of August, September, and a good part of October, it was the sports law story of that 6 to 8 week period. It had everything. It had sex, race relations, the issue of consent, the allegations of sexual violence, and as you pointed out, a real trial. I mean, we're sports lawyers. We talk about sports law, and for once, you had an O.J. Simpson type of circus playing out over, a 1 week to 2 week period with wall to wall, trial commentary and coverage. I mean, our first 2 out of our first 3 episodes were devoted to Derrick Rose. So I think it just became this volcano that erupted and was an exciting, case to cover.
Right, and I think, like we were talking about at the very beginning about how we had these big stories break at the right time with the HGH gate breaking as Peyton Manning is making his Super Bowl run, with, Russian doping breaking before the Olympics. This sort of the trial happening right as the NBA season is getting underway. It was a perfect time for this story to break because you had this, will he or won't he? Will he be in the courtroom or will he be at the game? How much time is he going to miss from trial versus how much time is he going to miss from practice or from playing with his teammates on the court? And so it was this sort of situation where, especially in the New York media as well, with him being on the Knicks this year. It was a great time for the trial and all the news surrounding it to break open and really hit the media and hit the fans, and that was a perfect time for it to break open.
Yeah, there's not only that, but it also had an impact on the three biggest media markets in the U.S. He obviously was playing on the Knicks. He's from Chicago, was a Chicago Bull forever, and then the trial was in L.A. So it kind of touched all of these markets. It really drew interest from different fan bases across the U.S. And it was interesting because I'm from Chicago. I was a Bulls season tickets holder until we moved a couple of years ago. But talking to people in Chicago, they still felt like, talking to them just when I was back a few weeks ago, they didn't think that it really got that much media coverage in Chicago, and it wasn't that widely reported on, which is interesting. And it was one of those stories for me that I really started to notice different media outlets covering things in different ways, and specifically certain New York outlets, and I won't name them, but national outlets with New York branches or big New York outlets basically being completely hands off of the story, except for reporting like bare facts. And I think part of that is they want to have a relationship with this athlete moving forward. They didn't want to report some of the more vulgar, or whatever you want to call it, allegations, and so they would just intentionally remove themselves from the coverage.
And then there was the New York Post.
Yeah, there was the other side of
the
it.
New York Post. Julia Marsh, who's a friend of the programs and a friend of ours, actually flew out to Los Angeles to cover the trial for 10 days and gave us expert columns, right? We had dueling columns, one day taking respective sides of the case. So I think the tabloids in New York, such as the New York Daily News, the New York Post, blanketed the case. And of course, online publications such as, Deadspin and Think Progress, completely went to town on the Derrick Rose case. By the way, we didn't talk about the result. Derrick Rose ended up with a defense verdict, and, he prevailed following a trial. The case is now on appeal, and it is on a slow docket in the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. We probably will not get an appellate decision until late next year, after Derrick Rose is already in training camp for either the New York Knicks or some other team following his free agency. So the story is not over, but I don't think it will ever reach the buzz that it had throughout the months of September and October. It was truly a great story, and there was some really top-notch reporting on it, while some papers may have ducked the controversy. I think the tabloids in New York and several of the publications, newspapers in L.A. Really blanketed the case.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you guys have any ideas of cases that are out there right now that we may get that big O.J. Simpson-like trial in 2017? Just off the top of your head?
Joe, I'll let Ian answer, because he is Mr. New Orleans, and he has one case in his own backyard that is my candidate.
Yeah, Joe McKnight case is certainly a situation where that may be an athlete involved. We recently had the Will Smith case. That's not a future one, but where Will Smith was killed by another football player, although not a professional one. And Cardell Hayes was convicted of the jury of manslaughter in that case. So New Orleans seems to be the hub for professional football players being killed and then subsequent trials. Let's hope that we don't have any more hometown stars that are killed anytime soon.
Yeah. And it's a hub for sports law, apparently, too. It seems like every guest on this show recently is from Tulane Law School or has some connection to New Orleans.
Right. Got to shout out to my alma mater, great Tulane sports law program, and certainly y'all have Gabe coming on. That's going to be a great podcast. But he does a lot of work to help keep New Orleans to be a sports law mecca for us.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure on you tonight, Ian. You're in between Warren Zola and Gabe Feldman. Good luck to you on that. Those are two titans of sports law. And I personally think the McKnight case has the potential to be probably a very exciting trial and major sports law story for 2017 because of look what it has. It has white on black violence and a referendum on stand your ground laws and the Castle Doctrine and it could go to trial. And most cases we talk about are either handled at the appellate level or we report based on, court filings. This one will be an emotional, intense, multi-day trial taking place in Jefferson Parish in New Orleans, just like the Will Smith trial received a monumental amount of attention when it actually went to trial. I think McKnight's going to be even bigger.
Yeah, I think it could be. And a couple other ones that caught my eye, I think that have the potential to go to trial either late this year or early next are the JPP Adam Schefter ESPN trial in Dan's backyard in Florida. As well as there's this Lance Armstrong false claims case that's really flying under the radar. It's a kind of a fascinating case. It's in D.C. We have potentially the Thabo Sefolosha civil case against the NYPD. Those are a few that I have kind of tabbed down and I'm keeping an eye on that have the potential to go to trial. We've seen Sefolosha already go to trial in his criminal case. And so you'd think that maybe he'll settle if the NYPD offers him a sizable amount of money, but he seems to be taking this thing on principle, so that's one that I could see very likely to go to trial.
JPP could be huge. You're talking about ESPN, Adam Schefter, coming on the heels of these sizable judgments against media companies in these invasion of privacy lawsuits. You have the Gawker case and the Aaron Andrews case. Should the lawsuit filed by JPP, Jason Pierre-Paul, actually go to trial, I think that is going to be a national story that will move the needle. But I'm skeptical that this will ever get to trial. I think if it survives a motion for summary judgment, you'll see the parties, settle because at some point this is a matter of, it's never the principle. It's about the money, and I don't see that JPP is going to suffer greatly financially because, as a result of this disclosure. He's had a terrific season and will likely sign a major contract in free agency during the offseason. So I think the parameters of a settlement, a reasonable settlement, may be in the high 7 figures, low 8 figures, are probably already in place. So I would be surprised to see it go to trial. But if it does go to trial, this could be the big one of 2017.
Well, I've managed to get us pretty far off topic here, as usual. But bringing us back to our list, we're now down to the top 4. Number 4 is the kind of a broad group, but the college sexual assault cases. And this, I think the headliner here is obviously the Baylor cases, which, obviously just a ton of lawsuits stemming from that. There's, to my knowledge, 4 Title IX lawsuits filed by, I think there's between 8 and 10 women suing the school for failure to supervise the students, many of which are athletes. There's been legal action by Art Briles, the ex-coach, suing the Board of Regents over basically a defamation claim. He's claiming that he's prevented from getting a job because of the way they've handled the case. And there's this Pepper Hamilton reports. Pepper Hamilton's a Philadelphia law firm. They came in, did an internal investigation of what happened. They came out with a 15 to 20 page, I can't remember exactly how long it was, recommendations for the school on what happened and what they should change, but they never actually put together a full report. And so there's some of the stories that they never put together a report, so they can't disclose it in these various lawsuits. And that was clearly an intentional move by Baylor to take advantage of the attorney-client privilege in order to block, a lot of the details that from these various cases and incidents among Baylor athletes and other Baylor students, in an effort to limit their legal liability. And I think there's been a lot of doublespeak coming from Baylor, and that they want to be transparent and they want to move on, but at the same time they're acting in a way that's, potentially concealing what's actually happened in order to avoid legal liability. So that's just a legal mess. There's things coming from every direction in that case. And then additionally, we kind of touched on it already, but the Minnesota case was a big one in 2016, and so was a little earlier in the year, University of Tennessee case, and I don't know if you guys remember, or I think the Title IX lawsuit with Tennessee settled.
Yeah, it was it was 8 female plaintiffs, I think, and it was about a $2.5 million settlement in the Tennessee case.
Yeah, which I think is the record for a Title IX case, the record settlement. Because I think before that was the Jameis Winston settlement with FSU, which I think was just under $1 million, which was the record at the time, and then the University of Tennessee case tripled that. So obviously that's a big issue. $2.5 million settlement's huge. There's other lawsuits out there, such as University of Kansas has one against it. Some others, obviously the 4 at Baylor. Why did you guys think that these were some of the bigger issues in 2016?
Well, I think that this is a sort of thing that we kept seeing it crop up. I think Baylor was the one that really broke through the media and became more of a headline issue. Having Ken Starr involved, doesn't hurt either. As someone who's been involved with sexual legal cases in the past, but I think that this is the sort of thing that is going to be an issue going forward into 2017 and beyond, where there are going to be these issues that come up. It's a similar sort of thing to domestic violence cases that we're going to get to, but it's the sort of thing where does the university have the institutional control? Are they believing the coach? Are they sweeping it under the rug? What are they doing with the players? There's so many different issues involved in these cases, legal issues, and then you have the Title IX issues and the effect on the plaintiffs and sexual assault issue cases are something that it's very serious. And it's a situation where there can be a lot of misrepresentations thrown around, as we saw with the Derrick Rose case. There can be a lot of issues, whether it's race involved, and a lot of misreporting and misunderstanding too. So there's all kinds of media, legal, NCAA issues involved in all of these cases. It's kind of a full package, I think, and it's the sort of thing that colleges are going to have to deal with for years to come. And really, there's going to have to be a way to figure out how, the NCAA is going to have to talk to universities and its member schools and see if they can figure out a better system to address this, because obviously it's a problem that athletic departments and their staff are having an issue with. One, preventing this thing from happening, and 2, how to address it after it has come to their attention. It's obviously an issue, and they're going to have to find some way to resolve that in a better way, more productive way going forward.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I remember speaking with an associate general counsel of a big university earlier this year, and I asked her, what's the biggest legal concern that you have? And mind you, this isn't just the athletic department; this is the associate general counsel of the whole university. And she said, Title IX. We're really worried about Title IX. It's huge right now. We want to make sure we're doing everything we possibly can. We want to make sure we're following the law. We want to make sure that we're helping our students out, because I think that these cases not only, obviously they're horrible allegations, but you're looking at it from a university perspective, but they're not only expensive, but it casts the school in a terrible light. And it's, I think there's probably a lot of parents second-guessing sending their children to schools that have these allegations that they're just so out of control, and that really hurts the school from a number of layers.
Right, and I think it hits the sort of trifecta where, schools are in a tight position where, they obviously have relationships and obligations with their employees, with the coaching staff, with the athletic director. They obviously have an obligation to help and protect their students who are on the football team or basketball team or whatever team it may be. But they also absolutely have an obligation to the other students who may be affected by the players in their athletic organizations and athletic teams who are committing these acts. And so it's a sort of situation where the university is in the tight spot of having duties to all the parties involved. And I think that's part of the reason why these issues are so thorny.
Yeah, that's a great point. So definitely something to keep an eye on moving forward. That's not going anywhere. And we're finally down to the top 3, and we actually have a tie for number 2 and number 3, both receiving 20 of the possible 30 votes. The first one is legalizing sports betting. And Dan, I'll throw that one over to you to kind of give the background of what happened this year with the highlight of the Christie 2 case.
Well, yeah, when we talk about live court proceedings, perhaps the biggest one of them all was the en banc rehearing that the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit conducted in the middle of February. New Jersey has been down this road before. It had tried to legalize sports betting in 2012 and ran into an adverse federal circuit court opinion that opened the door to Christie 2. The prior opinion essentially, in so many words, said New Jersey would be able to repeal. In order to avoid the constitutional problem, New Jersey has a choice, and one of the choices would be to repeal it would either be to maintain its sports betting prohibitions or to repeal them, and it would be up to the state to determine the exact contours of that kind of prohibition. So New Jersey followed through and went ahead and repealed their law, but only in part. And what New Jersey did was decriminalize sports gambling at casinos and racetracks, and at nowhere else. And the Third Circuit conducted a hearing in February, which led to an August divided opinion, 9-3. There were 12 judges on the en banc panel, and the Third Circuit concluded that New Jersey's plan to legalize sports betting through this partial repeal violated PASPA. And in any event, PASPA remains the law of the land, and the court rejected New Jersey's attempt to argue that the law was unconstitutional. So the Third Circuit decision was the big decision in the sports betting arena this year, and New Jersey again reached potentially the end of the road, but after the Third Circuit issued its opinion, New Jersey filed a petition for writ of certiorari with the U.S. Supreme Court, and we're about to find out 2 weeks from today and 2 weeks from tomorrow whether the U.S. Supreme Court will accept review of the Christie 2 case. Now, the reason this is a big story is we're talking about the future of sports gambling in the United States. It is not simply about the state of New Jersey. If New Jersey were to prevail before the Supreme Court, it would open up the floodgates for sports betting nationally. Following New Jersey, you would see a whole host of states enact similar laws. And even with even if the Supreme Court were to deny certiorari, the New Jersey sports betting case is the tip of the iceberg. We're just at the beginning of probably a 3 to 5 year period over which sports betting will probably become legal. The question is, will it be legal through a court decision? Will it be legal because another state successfully challenges PASPA? Or will Congress ultimately amend or repeal PASPA to allow states the option of authorizing sports betting within their borders? And there are so many moving parts here. You've got Christie 2, you got the potential Supreme Court possibility. You have states like New York and Mississippi that have begun to make a little bit of noise about challenging PASPA in court. You have New Jersey reacting to its loss in Christie 2 by threatening to completely decriminalize sports betting within its state. And then on another front, the American Gaming Association, which is the trade arm or the lobbying arm of the U.S. casino industry, they are beginning in 2016 and 17 to actively lobby for a repeal of PASPA. So there's so much that has already happened, with much more to follow in 2017. So in my opinion, the New Jersey sports betting case is about the broader subject of legalizing sports betting nationally.
Yeah, I think the big thing that I saw was, in Christie 1, New Jersey basically lost at every level. And in Christie 2, that same pattern continued, but then when we got to the appeal level, they lost the appeal and they filed for en banc, which is a bit of a Hail Mary, right? I mean, Dan, what's the percentage of cases?
Like less than zero? No.
Yeah.
The percentage. I'll put a finer point on it. Most circuit courts of appeal throughout the country hear only a couple of en banc cases each year out of hundreds that are filed. The rate of en banc grant, the rate of an en banc grant within the circuit courts is probably lower than the percentage rate for getting a petition for writ of certiorari granted by the U.S. Supreme Court. It hardly ever happens. In 2015, the Third Circuit only heard one en banc case, and I think this year they may have heard 2 or 3. So it was a signal that the issue of PASPA and whether it remains a constitutional law, that is a hotly contested issue within the Third Circuit, and that gives proponents of sports betting hope that the Supreme Court may weigh in and grant cert, because the issues raised in the Christie 2 case transcend sports betting. The issues framed for the Supreme Court focus on whether the federal government, whether Congress, can prevent states from repealing their own laws. And that presents a greater threat to state autonomy than the Christie 1 case did. And there are many who believe, and I'm among them, that New Jersey's cert chances before the U.S. Supreme Court are actually pretty decent. I think certiorari will probably be denied just based on a numbers game, because we only have 8 justices and you need 4 that would have to decide to hear it. And then even if cert is granted, New Jersey would need to win 5 out of 8 of those justices unless a 9th is appointed in time. So the roadblocks are still up there and the barriers are still in place. New Jersey is a long way away from winning that Christie case. They've lost at every stage. But I believe 2017 will be a breakthrough year in sports betting, either because another state will take up the challenge or New Jersey will follow through on its promise to completely repeal its sports betting prohibitions. And if that happens, I think that might be the beginning of the end of PASPA.
Right. And I think that, honestly, seeing the cert grant as unlikely with the Supreme Court, I'm personally rooting for the nuclear option in New Jersey. I just think that would be a fascinating situation to watch unfold. It would be great for us to cover it, and it would be just an amazing thing to see. One, obviously, how the courts deal with it. It's going to go through court, even though the courts have said that that's the sort of thing that would pass muster. And then also how the subsequent legislation goes. It would be a free-for-all, basically, in the state of New Jersey, and would just be a great kind of experiment to see how this would all work. I'm rooting for it just from an interest standpoint.
Yeah, I think that would also really put the pressure on the sports leagues to come to the table and start turning their tune as far as pushing for federal or state regulation of sports betting, which is ultimately, I think, where everyone wants to end up. But at the same time, the way to get there may be through this drastic nuclear option or continued litigation.
Yeah, I want to see it for no other reason than to see all the cold takes out there that say, oh, it's never going to happen. No politician is ever going to vote in favor of a complete repeal. Well, I call BS on that, because we're talking about New Jersey. They've gone down this road so many times, and now they're backed into a corner. And I view this as more of a tactic to get to their ultimate goal than a desire to completely decriminalize it. They don't have to completely decriminalize it. They can phase in restrictions under the language of, or as the dissenting opinion from Judge Fuentes suggested, what's to stop New Jersey from completely repealing its sports betting prohibition and then layering on like later enacted restrictions such as an age or a location restrictions. So there are many ways to skin the cat, and the New Jersey story is far from over. And I think even if the Supreme Court denies cert, New Jersey will go through with some form of another repeal, either a complete repeal or a more realistic partial repeal that is not quite as selective as the casino-friendly and the racetrack-friendly repeal law that was passed in 2014. So, New Jersey will remain in the mix for legalizing sports gambling, but I would expect to see, my prediction for 2017 is that Mississippi will be the next state to take up the battle.
You can bet on it.
First joke of the night. All right, there we go.
Yeah, we need to improve the joke ratio, I think.
All right, well, tied for number 2, moving on to the second to last one now. Tied for number 2 was domestic violence cases in pro sports, and this encompassed really a couple different categories. The first one is the Major League Baseball cases, and those are, of course, the Aroldis Chapman, Jose Reyes, suspensions that were divvied out, as well as I'm blanking on the third player who got suspended's name. He was an Atlanta Braves pitcher, I believe. And then Yasiel Puig who ultimately wasn't suspended but was investigated by Major League Baseball. And really, this was interesting to me, at least, because this was the first time that the Major League Baseball's new domestic violence policy was put into place. The policy was agreed upon between the Players Association and the league in, I believe it was fall or maybe winter of last year. And this was the first year it was put into place. And it was an interesting strategy by Rob Manfred. The policy basically gave him wide-ranging latitude to choose the number of games, choose how it was implemented, how long, things like that. It gave him a ton of power. And ultimately, we saw him take the strategy of coming to agreements with players rather than just arbitrarily picking a number. And I really think that he was doing this in order to kind of set precedents. So later on, if he wants to give a player a number for a certain type of alleged action, then he can do so and have some precedents to back it up. If the player appeals, then ultimately files a lawsuit. So the way that they went about divvying out domestic violence suspensions in sort of their first run at it this year was pretty fascinating for me. We saw suspensions, I think ranging from like 35 games to 75 games in those general areas. It's tough to say why he picked one number of games or the other. I'm sure arguments can be made in that effect. And then, of course, the other category, which is essentially one case on its own, which is the Josh Brown case, which was a pretty unique one with the NFL, where they suspended Josh Brown for one game after, I think, over a year-long investigation. And ultimately, a few weeks after that, more police documents were released, including his journal and some other documents that showed the true extent of what occurred between him and his now ex-wife Molly. And there was a huge public outcry into the one-game suspension, even though the NFL's policy, unlike the MLB's policy, does say a number of games that a player should be suspended. And the baseline number is 6 games, which can be lowered or raised depending on mitigating or aggregating factors. There's no clear mitigating factors here for Josh Brown, so they somehow came to 1 game. We will never know. The NFL reopened the Josh Brown investigation, and the New York Giants ended up cutting him because of the huge public outcry. And we really haven't heard from the NFL since then. There's been no clear determination that they're going to keep investigating him, that they're ultimately going to come to any resolution whatsoever. We've done a podcast on this before. I think just about everyone has come to the conclusion that Josh Brown's playing career is over, and so the NFL may just want to let this one drift off into the sunset. But what did you guys think about the domestic violence cases this year?
Okay, I'll jump into the void here. I mean, if Rob Manfred has aced the domestic violence policy, Roger Goodell has continually flunks it. If every domestic violence case is a test of the policy, it just seems as whether we're talking about Ray Rice or Josh Brown or Ezekiel Elliott, there are significant shortcomings in how the policy has been applied. The process by which it has been investigated, and of course the ultimate punishment. You have with Elliott, his case is been placed in abeyance, probably because of the playoff run, that they don't want to deal with it during the NFL season. So questions are raised by that as to whether there are any improper influences on the punishment or the process by which a player is investigated. And of course, Josh Brown, coming on the heels of Ray Rice, is just simply more of the same from the NFL. But therein lies the difference between Manfred, a trained attorney, and Roger Goodell, not a trained attorney. Manfred was wise, and you nailed it on the head, Dan. He set out to settle and reach a compromise with a baseline suspension for several of these players to establish the type of precedent that Roger Goodell has never been able to accomplish. In fact, Goodell runs away and disavows any of the prior punishment as a comparator. So the difference between how the NFL and how Major League Baseball handled domestic violence cases, you couldn't get more stark and more different between the two approaches. I think it's a matter of consistency and clarity, and the NFL's application of the domestic violence policy. It just seems like it lacks any rhyme or reason, and every case raises a wealth of questions about whether the punishment and the process were fair.
Right, and I think that, like you were saying, this is a study in contrast, just like the CBA negotiations, with the MLB, able to reach an amicable conclusion with the players and to try to have something that is a progression and that works for them and that is going to be something positive for them moving forward. I think the same sort of thing in this case. The MLB and the players were able to reach a domestic violence policy that they're now putting into effect properly, and the NFL is kind of proceeding as it continues to do in seemingly every legal case haphazardly and inconsistently. And so I think that's another one of those study in contrast in terms of the management at the top. And I think that this is maybe not the best comparison, but another comparison is we just were talking about the college sexual assault cases. To me, I think that these domestic violence cases are another situation where the league has to figure out some sort of proactive way to deal with these cases in a better way. And certainly MLB has figured out how to do that, and the NFL maybe hasn't quite figured it out yet, and may never will. We'll have to see, whether that depends on the leadership at the top. But they've got to talk to teams about, trying to do education with players. I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to help, but you have to look at ways to reach out to rookies, incorporate this into the rookie symposium that the Players Association does. There needs to be more upfront education about these sorts of issues too, in addition to the post hoc litigation and discipline issues that come about after these cases arise. But just like these sexual assault cases, the NFL and all leagues, not just the NFL, but all leagues have to figure out a way to try to deal with these cases up front and prevent them from happening. A lot of what we talk about in the sports law world is what happens after they do, but I don't think there's enough being talked about as to how the leagues can get players, to stop doing these things and to be more responsible.
Yeah, I think to piggyback on that point, another thing they need to do is really focus on the victim. And, we saw in the Josh Brown case where it seemed like the NFL investigators were scaring her almost, where she was afraid when they would call her. And there's supposedly programs in place to do outreach, but there's no real evidence that actually happens or that they have a real good sense of how to do that. And honestly, the most important thing here is, like you said, it's prevention is fantastic, but it's tough to do that. You can do as much as you can as far as education, but unfortunately, assuming that this is going to occur, I think rehabilitation is really the other aspect that's important. And, frankly, the MLB, for example, hasn't done a fantastic job of that either. It was reported that Chapman went to one counseling session, after, as a part of his treatment, quote unquote treatment, during his suspension this past year. And really, when he was traded to the Cubs and questioned about the incident, didn't show a whole lot of remorse or any recognition that he had done anything wrong. And so I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And to that point, because of these new collective bargaining agreements, are number 6 in both the MLB and NBA, which, as I mentioned, we don't have them yet, so we don't quite know everything that's in there, but it's been reported that the NBA is going to have a brand new domestic violence policy. They don't technically have one yet. They have a policy against violent felonies, which may or may not include a domestic violence incident. And the MLB was reported to maybe renegotiate some of the details of that policy as well. So certainly this is another issue that's going to keep coming up again and again, and we'll see the NFL in the Ezekiel Elliott case, as Dan noted, and potentially the application of some new some new policies in the MLB and NBA. Yeah, and for the record, Dan mentioned that, I'll just stir the pot here a little bit, but comparing Goodell and Manfred, I don't particularly think that Rob Manfred's done a good job with the policy. It's certainly better than the NFL, but I think there's a lot of things that they're lacking. And I don't know if the right approach was to settle all these cases. I mean, if they're confident in what they collectively bargained, he should suspend a player based on his discipline. If they appeal that, that's the time to test the policy. So in my opinion, for him to come out and give a player a lesser number of games as a quote-unquote settlement so they won't appeal it is kind of undercutting his own power and his own collective bargaining.
Right, and I think that I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think it'll be interesting to see going forward. You know, certainly these were the first cases under the policy. So it'll be interesting to see if, look, this is the sort of conflict-averse, policy that he takes and an approach that he takes towards the DV policy, or if he looked at it as, look, let me get these first few cases out of the way and try to figure out how we handle these. But certainly this is something that's new for all of the leagues. Not a new situation, but a new way of dealing with all of these domestic violence situations. And certainly the media spotlight on these cases is even brighter and stronger than it has been ever in the past. So I think the leagues are all kind of tiptoeing around these sort of situations, or at least, you know, they should be. The NFL may not be tiptoeing quite so well, but, you know, certainly it'll be interesting to see if Manfred continues this approach or if this was just a one-off in terms of we have a new policy and let me get these precedents sort of thing. But yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that this was necessarily the best move from a bigger picture, but we'll have to see if it's a one-off or not.
Okay, my final point on this one is that, you know, Manfred's hands are somewhat tied, or to a limited extent, they're tied by the absence of a criminal adjudication. I mean, in some of these domestic violence so-called cases, you know, in the Chapman case and the Familia case, the criminal prosecution either was, you know, just dropped or just did not proceed, either because of good lawyering or the victim just didn't want to pursue the case. So you have to balance the need for an effective domestic violence policy and have some sense of proportion with the fact that the cases are just accusations, and, you know, the MLB and the NFL are wading into intrafamily disputes where there has been no real fact finding, and the criminal justice system has basically either let it go or not pursued it. So it's a real hard case when you don't have a conviction or a willing, you know, witness, you know, willing to give testimony.
And I think that Dan, former commissioner of the NFL, Paul Tagliabue, would probably agree spot on with you right there. I mean, that was a big part of his evaluation when doing discipline cases, to try to see how the legal situation worked itself out, how the criminal justice system evaluated the case before acting. That's been a big part of the reason why the players have had a big issue with Goodell and how he's jumped on disciplinary proceedings, not just in the domestic violence area, but in all disciplinary proceedings.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely something that underlies all of commissioner discipline in sports, especially when there is no conviction, which is in, you know, the vast majority of these domestic violence and sexual assault cases. So difficult. And there's been a lot of really good articles and things written about balancing both sides of that equation. And we had Diana Moskovitz of Deadspin on, who was one of the more interesting conversations we've had, a little out-of-the-box ideas and how to fix the policy. So I'd recommend you guys going back and listening to that one if you haven't already. And without further ado,
drum roll, please.
We finally made it to number one, and if you haven't guessed it already, it is Deflategate, and also wrapped into that, the Adrian Peterson case. Gentlemen.
The daddy of all gates. There are people who think Watergate was named after Deflategate. It has become the definitive gate among all gates. But Ian, any initial thoughts on what Deflategate means and how it fits into our top 10 list? I think by far it's number one unanimously.
Well, It's a good thing this one to me because I think the only one who didn't put it at the top of my list. I had it a little bit farther down.
What?
I think in terms of domestic media attention in the United States, I think it obviously has to be up there as number one. Certainly in terms of the amount of coverage the case got, in terms of how the case captured the public's attention, or drove the public away, at least the non-Boston sports fan public were at a certain point tired of hearing about it. But for us as sports law commentators and sports lawyers, obviously this was our bread and butter, and we all three of us at least loved this, and everybody else did too in the community, sports law community. I think the mind-boggling thing about the Deflategate, the Brady and Peterson precedents combined is just the sheer amount of precedent that Goodell now has behind him for his extremely broad. I mean, I don't even know if you can still say extremely broad. Maybe unlimited is a perhaps better, more accurate term. But just this idea that Goodell can shoehorn almost anything. I don't know if almost is a good qualifier there, but can shoehorn anything into conduct detrimental. Precedent no longer matters. In terms of what prior arbitrators have decided, he can ignore precedent. He just has to give some sort of colorable explanation for his discipline at this point. And just if you think about the logical extension just of the massive power that he has now, I mean, I think it got brought up on y'all's podcast with Bob McGovern a few episodes ago. But
you listened to that?
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
But this idea that you can now be punished for general awareness of others' rule breaking, and whether or not the NFL and Goodell choose to actually go forward with that sort of overreach doesn't really matter. I think the fact is that Goodell now has that power. He can punish any player for being generally aware of others' rules breaking, even if they're not another player, if it's just an employee of a team. It'd be interesting to see a situation where it was a non-employee of a team, like a stadium employee or something like that, or a media member. I think all of that sort of thing is something that would be upheld by a court under this precedent, at least in the Second Circuit's jurisdiction. Maybe not in other jurisdictions, but it's just a vast, wide-reaching opinion that continues to allow Goodell to wreak havoc on the league's PR and legal system and how player discipline is evaluated.
Yeah, I mean, after all, wasn't Jimmy Haslam generally aware of a scheme to defraud in his trucking business? I mean, we could take this to so many extremes. I mean, this is the case of them all, the case that spawned our podcast, Conduct Detrimental. The implications of the Peterson decision and the Brady decision are going to govern and overshadow, player management, disciplinary disputes, for the next generation, unless and until there's an alteration in the collective bargaining agreement or another federal judicial circuit decides the issue differently. I mean, the law of the Second Circuit and Eighth Circuit is pretty clear. But I think players, I don't think the courthouse door is closed to the resolution of the scope of Commissioner Goodell's powers. Extreme judicial deference is given to arbitration awards, and the facts of Peterson and Brady were so player friendly in terms of the process that I was surprised by the outcome, not just in one of those cases, but both of them. But I don't think all hope is lost. I think there could be another test case down the line. It just may not have to be. It just may be in a different circuit.
Yeah, and I think that's the best route because from everything that we've heard from Roger Goodell's mouth, the one thing that he really won't give up, unless it's just, I don't even know what the players would have to give up to get it, but it is this power, this overarching power to discipline players. And so, I hear all these stories. Well, are the players going to step up during the next CBA? And it's just unreasonable to think that they would lock out over this one piece because really, and we've said this before, but when you think about it, only a handful of players get suspended under these this provision in any given year. No player thinks it's going to be them. Ask Tom Brady that, and So when it comes down to the vote on a CBA, whether we hold out over this one provision or we don't, they're going to cave. They're going to cave for the money. They're going to cave for other things they're seeking. They're not going to want to give up an 18-game schedule. I just don't see any possibility of that happening. So, the only way to change this and to change the standard will be for a court to come in and rule differently. And, if it is a different circuit, that would set up a circuit split, and then ultimately we could see that next case, if it goes in the player's favor, end up in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, Dan, what do you think would have happened if the Players Union had filed in the District of Massachusetts? Of course, the NFL won the race to the courthouse. They time the issuance of the arbitration ruling so that they can basically race to the Southern District Clerk and file a suit. But if Brady had filed in the District of Massachusetts and had advanced the argument that the NFL had fraudulently or anticipatorily, raced to the courthouse to win the forum battle, I think the outcome in the District of Massachusetts federal court and potentially the First Circuit could have been different. But that's all for posterity, and bad cases make bad law, and for the next 3-4 years, I don't think we're going to have a case that reaches the magnitude of Tom Brady or Adrian Peterson. But we didn't see either of these two cases coming 2-3 years ago, and I'm hopeful that this issue will get teed up in another federal judicial circuit so that we can ultimately have a circuit split to maybe reach the Supreme Court. But for my money, we could talk about the implications of Deflategate for 2, 3, 4 hours. But for my money, this was definitely the oral argument of the year. Not only was it the best case of the year, the top sports law story of the year, but it was the most compelling oral argument. I attended the Second Circuit oral argument in early March, and after the first 5 minutes, I was sitting in a row right next to Alan Milstein and Michael McCann. And after 5 minutes, we were looking at each other with that kind of look that Brady's got this in the bag. And then you could just feel the air come out of the room, the deflating of the room with the hostile line of questioning. And you just got the sense that everything just pivoted within the span of a couple of seconds, and it became very apparent. And that's why oral argument is such a wonderful vehicle. It leaves very little doubt in your mind as to who wins or loses by the end of the argument. And at the end of that 1 hour hearing, there was no doubt in any of our minds that Brady was going to lose the appeal. And the swiftness in which the decision was released, a mere 4 or 5 weeks after oral argument, which is lightning fast for a federal appellate decision, speaks volumes. What?
Even with the dissent, too.
Yeah. The whole thing came down in 5 weeks, but we knew the result when we walked out of that courthouse on March 2nd. There was no question that Brady had lost, and that really points to how exciting and how meaningful attending or being part of a federal appellate oral argument is. When you're there, you can hear and feel the entire case encapsulated in 1 hour.
Yeah, I would recommend our listening audience to, if you could, just go for any case, especially if you know the background, and go listen to an oral argument. I've gone over to the Supreme Court a number of times, the U.S. Supreme Court, and listened to arguments there. That is an absolutely once-in-a-lifetime fascinating experience. So if you're in D.C., anyone can do it. You just have to get there a little early, depending on the day.
New Jersey sports betting in April?
Yeah, I'll be there if it goes.
Okay.
But
will somebody sponsor us? We need sponsors.
Yet.
Yeah, I think we need sponsors to send us to court hearings all over the country. If someone's willing to sponsor us, we're there.
Yeah, but this really was the case that had it all. It had the big name player. It had this sort of classic. You could call Goodell a villain. This guy who is overreaching in his powers and arbitrariness, and you also have the background of the case in terms of the fact that it had to be, of course, the Patriots, who had the prior history of Spygate, who have legions of NFL fans who love to hate them because they're so good, among other reasons. And you've got, of course, the timing of it again. We talk about all these cases, the particular timing originally when this all happened in the lead up to the Super Bowl, and then again the oral argument timing happens, at this precise right moment when there's no other sports law news going on, and it has the perfect opportunity to blow up once again. A year and a half, 2 years after it all kicks off, and this case had it all. The characters, the timing, the story, the drama. It was everything.
And the national media attention. I mean, there were so many superstars throughout, the entire coverage of Deflategate. I mean, it just seemed Michael McCann became a household name. Great reporting from, Michael Hurley, Bob McGovern, Gary Myers, Ben Volen. It was the most, what makes it, in my opinion, the top sports law story of the year was just the sheer volume of national media coverage.
Don't sell yourself short on that either, Dan.
Oh yeah, and White Bronco and Wallach Legal and Ian P. Gunn and Rafi Melkonian. I mean, you had lawyers. What was that?
Hashtag appellate Twitter.
Yeah, you had lawyers making their debut on this case that no one had ever heard of, and as a result of Deflategate, so many of us are still in the game. So it's the case that gave birth, for better or for worse, I think for better, to a lot of the sports law commentary that is now, blanketing Twitter and blogs. And, I mean, it probably gave us the motivation to cross over and start weighing in on a number of other stories. Before Deflategate, I was just sports betting and fantasy sports. That was the case that kind of put me over and thought, well, now I can start to write about other things. So Deflategate was an integral part of my development in the sphere of sports law. Without it, I think I'd still be in this, sports betting, cauldron. And Deflategate really convinced me and excited me about a wealth of sports law issues that just go beyond sports gambling.
Yeah, well, I think we've hit our record time. We're pushing 2 hours now, gentlemen, so we should probably wrap it up before we...
Two-parter.
Yeah, maybe we should split it up. But Ian, thank you a ton for coming on. That was it was a lot of fun going through those. It was interesting to hear your. I think Dan and I's lists were probably closer aligned. Yours was a little bit different, so that was great.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. Always a lot of fun, and y'all are great. I mean, everybody needs to listen to this podcast, and every time I've listened to it, I've learned something and had a lot of fun. This is, the best sports law podcast out there. You guys are doing that at a record pace right now. You're not going to be able to keep it up.
I take that as a challenge. But
yeah, and thank you for saying that, Ian. And we go back tomorrow trying to make sense of the world of sports law with Gabe Feldman. We're on a weekly pace. Some days or some weeks we have, 2 podcasts. It's a challenge. I'm practicing with a law firm, and I've got all these other outside responsibilities. But the most fun I have each week is to, join Dan and trying to, do a 1-hour podcast. It's been a challenge to, and it's been an interesting adventure and journey to try to, master this. This form of of this medium, and hopefully we'll keep getting better at it. But we look forward to having you on again.
Absolutely.
And if you so choose, you could be our in court correspondent for the Joe McKnight case whenever it goes to trial. But you're going to have to do battle with C.J. Mourdock over that slot.
I know. He's already been talking to me about it.
Yeah.
I would recommend. Ian is just a fantastic Twitter file as well. Is at Ian P. Gunn. So definitely give him a follow and check out the Sports Esquires. Not only every week are the links, but they also write some great stuff. Ian, are you working on other than the links dropping tomorrow? Are you working on any other articles?
I've got a few kind of in the pipeline right now. Probably nothing dropping too soon. Going to be catching up on work after the holidays, but. The Sports Law links will be out every week, and we'll have some interesting stuff. I'm working on kind of a multi-part series on NCAA amateurism and the future of that, which should be interesting, but I'm not sure when that will be done. But the links are always fun to do, and I know everybody likes those, so definitely check those out.
Nice. Yeah, and amateurism is an early favorite for our top 10 this next year, so that'll be great. Everyone check those out.
Yeah, Ian, are you do you have any post clerkship plans? Can you tell us about your current clerkship? I think you're judicial law clerk for a judge in Jefferson Parish.
Yeah, doing still clerking right now. No news to break as of yet, but I'll definitely let you guys know, and it'll be breaking news on conduct detrimental when I find out.
You'll be an unrestricted free agent soon.
Yeah, potentially.
All right.
Well, thanks again. We're looking forward to having you back on. We'll definitely have to make this an annual tradition. I think this was a good one.
Yes.
But we're going to have you on before that, I'm sure, as well. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. Again, we push the iTunes ratings. Those are super helpful to kind of get the word out. Tell your friends.
We're stuck at 7. We need more reviews.
I know. Hit that unlucky number 7. So
no,
well,
it's
anyway.
lucky. We've got 5. We've got excellent ratings from each one of our 7 respondents. Of course, each one of the 7 is my mom using different handles on iTunes. But if you can weigh in and give ratings, it might increase our visibility and help further promote the show. But we're doing our best to get the word out, and I think the work stands on its own. And we've had some really good podcasts, this one included, I think, and more to come. So we're not going away, and over the next year, we're going to have some great podcasts.
All right, with that, thanks, guys, and we'll talk to you soon.